Did you know that in Icelandic, they say flower the instead of the flower? Or that Hebrew and Arabic have no vowels? Or that your last name may reveal a noble character trait of an ancestor? Today, we're going to discuss the origin and development of different languages around the world, and how you can figure out so much about the values and development of a civilization by the words that its people use. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey friends, welcome to Timeless, the show where I discuss timeless, eternal topics. Just a reminder to please hit the subscribe button down below so that you can get a notification every time I post a new video. And also be sure to check out my news segment, which is the Julie Noted playlist on this channel. Today, as you know from the introduction, we're going to be talking about the origin and development of language. I have to credit a specific book and an author for inspiring me to discuss this subject with you. I actually have the book right here. It is The Story of Language by Mario Pai. This copy that I have in my hands was the last hard copy on Amazon of the original. This was published almost 100 years ago. Well, I should say almost 80 years ago, in 1949. And then subsequent copies were made, but this is actually out of print. And this guy, Mario Pai, writes 450 pages on this subject, the origin and development of language, and his command of knowledge is just astonishing. I also have to credit my dear friend and co-host, Dennis Prager, with whom I do the Dennis and Julie podcast with, for telling me about this book. Dennis actually read it when he was a junior in high school. I offhandedly mentioned on one of our episodes of Dennis and Julie that I think that it's so interesting the way that languages vary. That Chinese, for instance, represents pictorial representations, whereas English is quite different, and then there are these similarities between languages. And he said, "Oh, do I have a book for you?" So I'm going to tell you a bit about what I've learned through this book. I'm actually only halfway into it, so if you are interested in this and want a part two, I am happy to deliver. Language, I know it sounds very obvious, but it is worth sort of establishing here at the outset that language is one of the fundamental things that distinguishes us from animals. You know, individuals today who are atheists or materialists tend to make this argument that Homo sapiens, or human beings, are sort of nothing more than just one evolutionary step up from animals. And that is just so untrue. These individuals focus on the things that make us alike from animals, but they don't focus on the things that make us different from animals, and language is one of those primary things. Sure, it is true that some animals can communicate. Your dog barks, or even if you have a parrot can repeat some sounds. Even certain types of chimpanzees can repeat human words. But one of the distinguishing factors in communication between animals and humans is that animals cannot communicate about non-immediate situations. When your dog is barking, that is indicating an immediate danger or an immediate annoyance or an immediate excitement that that dog has. That dog cannot, talk about future dangers that you may have or future situations that you may be in. And that is one of the, again, distinguishing factors about human language, that we can talk about situations that haven't occurred yet. We can also talk about the past. And another thing, again, this is going to sound so obvious. There are going to be some of these examples throughout this show. But think about it. You know your dog's name, but your dog doesn't know your name. Isn't that kind of mind-blowing? Or maybe that's just kind of stupid. But the point that I'm trying to make is, by human beings naming other people or naming objects, that shows a level of sophistication and also a level of consciousness that animals do not possess. So again, language is really one of the fundamental things that makes us human. So let's move on to talking about the story of the development of language. We're going to then go on to how dialects or different languages sort of branched out. But let's start off with, how did we just get to talking in the first place? We have this idea that the earliest, most primitive humans, and I don't mean primitive as an insult, it is just true that thousands of years ago, those were primitive human beings. We have this idea that they pointed to a rock and said rock, and that is how we came to understand what a rock is. But that is not true. Over millions of years, there was a step-by-step process that I am about to quickly outline of how we got to speaking. Because think about a baby. Babies have to go through so much training and so much observation in order to speak. And it starts with different steps of sounding out different words. That is not different from what occurred with the earliest human beings. Language, our spoken language, actually isn't very natural. The fluidity and the rapidity with which we speak is not a natural thing. It has become natural over time because people have been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. But the earliest humans, like babies, had to learn how to verbally enunciate and how to say things. And also, what's astounding to think about is that at least babies have examples. They, all around them in the world, people are talking and they can observe that. But the earliest humans did not have other examples of other humans who spoke properly or with fluidity. And so they had to develop it on their own, which took thousands and thousands, indeed millions of years. So our first language was actually gestural language, which is still a part of our daily language. Even if you look, and I'm trying to work on this, by the way, even if you look at what I do on the show, when I make a point, I go like this, or we have gestural language all around us, and it supplements our verbal language. But for 1 million years, gestural language was the only language used by human beings. In fact, according to Mario Pai, the author of this book, there are 700,000 distinct elementary gestures that are produced by facial expressions, postures, movement of arms, wrists, fingers, etc. And that is so true. Again, we don't really acknowledge this or think about it, but there are so many ways that you can just communicate with gestures. So for these a million years that gestural language was used, it was very primitive because part of what has developed in the realm of gestural language is that gestural language needs to be supplemented by verbal or oral language in order to agree on what the gesture means. So to give an example, if I go like this, you know that I am drawing a heart, and you know that a heart is a symbol of love. That doesn't come naturally to us, of course. There needs to be a verbal agreement that this is a symbol of a heart and what a heart means. So even if you look at our street signs, for instance, I was driving to work today and I saw this sign of a guy walking and then an X over it. We have had to sort of verbally understand what those symbols mean. And even if you look at gestures that have become famous, like the fascist salute, that is such an example of how you need a verbal language to supplement what that means. Because the fascist salute of 20th century Europe, used by the followers of Mussolini and the followers of Hitler, means a very different thing to those people than it does to Native Americans or to Romans who also used that gesture. In fact, that fascist salute, which I am not going to do because someone will take a screenshot of me and then accuse me of being a bigot, but it is when your arm is up and outstretched. It was actually a peaceful symbol used in the Roman Empire in order to show whoever you were approaching that you were not hiding a concealed weapon. As I just mentioned, it is still used among certain Native American tribes. So it's amazing how that gestural symbol means something very different to those individuals than it does, of course, to people in Europe. And it shows the necessity of a supplement of verbal agreement. But there is one exception where certain gestures do not need a supplement of a verbal understanding, and that is communication of emotion. This to me is so interesting. Across all places and all times in history, no matter where you are in the world, what language you speak, what race you come from, etc., a smile indicates that you're happy. A frown indicates that you're sad. When you see a human being crying, you can tell if those are tears of joy or if those are tears of sorrow. Even laughter. Laughter is a fascinating thing because it can indicate a wide variety of emotions. When someone is laughing, it could be that they're friendly, it could be that they're feeling a bit shameful or awkward or humiliated. Laughter can also be a form of flattery, of unbelief, of surprise. But you know, as a human being, when someone is laughing, you know which category that laughter fits into. And I just think that is so amazing that there is this through line among all of us, that we are sort of all tethered together. Of course, there is a universality in human experiences in that all of us experience joy and all of us experience suffering. But there's also this added universality in that our emotions are expressed in very similar ways. So it makes sense that for those a million years, gestural language is what permeated because really things were just communicated through these expressions of emotion. Darwin explained why spoken language developed from gestural language, because believe it or not, there are large contingents of people who say that we should not have developed away from gestural language. Those individuals argue that if we had just kept and refined and became more advanced in our gestural language, then all people around the world could communicate with each other in the same language. That, of course, isn't true, because in the same way that language separates and becomes dialectized, that would also happen with gestures depending on where you are in the world. But Darwin explains why spoken language developed away from gestures. And the answer is that gestures require the use of hands, whereas spoken language is more efficient because you can use your hands to do other tasks where you can communicate speaking. Also, gestural language requires an unobstructed view, and of course, it requires sunlight. You need to be able to see the person with whom you are communicating in a gestural fashion. Spoken language is the opposite. You don't have to. You can be across the room from someone. You don't have to be looking at them. You can be in the dark, and you can still understand and communicate with them. In addition to Darwin, though, there was another language philosopher, if you will, who has developed this theory as to why spoken language was developed and served as a replacement, or I guess as a more superior supplement to gestural language. And this individual posits that since intentions and emotions get expressed through facial expressions and gestures in a sort of obvious way, language, that is spoken language, was designed to deceive people because it is much easier to hide your intentions or your real feelings in spoken language than to hide it with your face. That is why playing poker for people is such an interesting game, because if you are especially good at reading people's emotions, you can kind of see in their eyes or in their facial expressions what deck of cards they have. So we started off for a million years with gestural language, and then we transitioned to pictorial language. And this is where writing and spoken language developed sort of hand in hand and helped one another in turn. So what happened was people communicated by drawing a picture of a sun on a tablet, or if they wanted someone to do something, they would draw a picture of that human being shoveling. I don't know if there were shovels back then, but whatever the shovel equivalent would be. In other words, they communicated desires by drawing pictures of those things. And then the pictures sort of became more advanced. So instead of just indicating objects or indicating actions, the pictures started to be designed to represent more sort of metaphysical or abstract things. So someone would draw a sad face with a tear. Yes, maybe that would mean that someone was crying, but it would more generally come to express the feeling of sadness or grief or anguish. So from there, this is where pictorial writing transitioned into spoken writing. Certain images or objects were given a phonetic value, and those phonetic values were very primitive and very short at the beginning. Sun, for instance, back in the times of the Egyptians, was associated with the spoken word, if you will, of Re. So then what happened was individuals, when they would draw a sun on a piece of tablet, it would come not to be representing the sun, but it would come to represent the spoken word ray, or the spoken syllable ray, occurring in a larger word. So think about great. The ray in great would be the sun drawing. And so there would be a bunch of these pictorial images that you would use to sound out a word. And so again, isn't this interesting to show just brick by brick, slowly, we developed away from gestural language to pictorial language and to writing and to spoken language. And then once people were able to sound out words and get used to the physical practice of sounding out words, then their communication abilities grew with one another, and then they could attach certain words, full words as opposed to syllables, to objects. Again, just super interesting. And then writing also became more efficient and also concise. Because think about it, drawing all of these pictorial symbols to represent certain syllables is a very arduous task. It requires a lot of space on that tablet, and it requires a lot of time drawing. And so there developed these ways to have shortcuts. One of the shortcuts that we see in written language today is accents on words. For instance, if you look at the ñ on Spanish N's, an ñ is supposed to accentuate or indicate that there is emphasis on that N. So the word España has an ñ, or señor has an ñ. That is a shortcut from spelling España, E-S-P-A-N-N-N-N-N-N-A. You put an accent over that in order to shorten it. So again, just all of these things developed very slowly, and it wasn't intuitive. We just think that this just sprung out of nowhere, but it was a very, very slow process. So now let's move on to how dialects form. Now that we understand how language got to be developed in the first place, how did language then become diversified? Well, I'm going to zoom in on the Western world specifically. There are two branches, if you will, of languages that are spoken in the Western world, that is, in the Americas and in Europe. There is English, which is a Germanic language. Indeed, it is very similar to German. That is what is meant, of course, by Germanic language. And then there's a separate sort of family, if you will, of Western languages, and that is Romance languages. By the way, maybe I'm just a fool. I didn't realize why Romance languages are called Romance languages. It is because they originated in Rome, or in other words, they have a Latin origin, because Latin was the spoken language of the Roman Empire. So Romance languages are Italian, Spanish, and French. Sean and I thought that this was because those languages sound sexy, and that's why they're called Romance languages, but no, there is actually again, a much more practical reason for why they are called that. So if you look at English, this Germanic language, and then the separate family of Romance languages, which are Italian, Spanish, and French, there's a similarity across all of them, and that is that they are structured with subject, verb, object. So for instance, in English, we say, the boy walked to the supermarket. Subject, verb, object. That is the same in Spanish. You say, el niño camina al supermercado. I don't speak French, I don't speak Italian. I would give you the counterparts in those languages, but trust me, it follows that structure, if you will, of subject, verb, object. What makes English different from the Romance languages is that you switch the adjective in the noun. So in English, the adjective comes before the noun. You say, the red shoe. That is the opposite in Romance languages. In Spanish, for instance, you say, el zapato rojo. As you know from the introduction, in Icelandic, they switch the, oh gosh, now I'm going to need help with my, my labeling of certain words. What is the? This is so bad. It's not a preposition. What is it? Is it an adverb? My third grade or second grade teacher is hating me right now. Whatever the is, let's call it now an adverb. God, this is so embarrassing. They switch it. They don't say the flower, they say flower the. So it's just very interesting to see the way that languages are. To us, it's astounding that someone in Iceland would switch those two things. But that seems very natural to their ear. Just as Spanish speakers think it's weird that we say the red shoe instead of the shoe red. Just interesting tidbits. The is a preposition. Oh gosh, what did I say? It was an adverb? I'm sorry. I'm going to go home and brush up on the proper names of certain words. So the reason why English is a Germanic language as opposed to a Romance language is, of course, it has ties to German and the Germanic tribes, but also because the Roman Empire was relatively separate from these Germanic tribes. So what happened was these Germanic tribes conquered England. In the year like 1000, there was the Norman conquest of England, which we all learned about in history class and probably didn't know what the heck that was. That was just a Germanic tribe conquering England. That is why England has English as the spoken language. And it makes sense why English developed as the main language here in the United States, because we were colonized by the British. So they brought over English when they came and colonized us. But this is different, of course, for Romance languages because of the extent and the reach of the Roman Empire. If you look at the map that my producers are going to put up right now, the Roman Empire at its height had such an astounding reach. Obviously, it had covered all of Italy, but it also extended into places like France, Spain, and even North Africa. And so the Roman Empire had a very systemized set of the Latin language. The Latin language was the language of all government institutions. It was inscribed on every single building throughout the empire. Also, there was a very systemized education system, so everyone in school learned Latin. So that sort of lended to this unity all throughout the Roman Empire of Latin being spoken. The one sort of exception to that was when the Roman Empire conquered parts of Greece. Greek was a language that developed sort of alongside and tangentially, to Latin, but that's why there are some Greek borrow words in the Latin language and vice versa. The is not a preposition. Yes, that sounded weird. Was I right? Did I say adverb? Damn. You know what, Sean? I'm glad you corrected me, but I wouldn't have known the difference anyway. Okay, I am so sorry. The is not a preposition. The is an adverb. I love, sometimes when I think about this, I could tell you, as those of you who listen to Timeless know, I could tell you more about the difference between the Sunni and Shia sects of Islam than I could identify what the is. That's kind of embarrassing. Again, I'm going to brush up on that. So there was this unity of Latin spoken all throughout the Roman Empire. By the way, just as a quick aside, you know how many people today say that Christianity is a white supremacist religion and it's a religion only for rich people? Tell them this fact. Have this one in your back pocket. Christianity was one of the biggest contributors towards literacy in the Roman Empire. So classical Latin was the language that was spoken in the Roman Empire. People like Cicero and Caesar and Erasmus took great pride in being able to achieve a very high standard of vocabulary and syntax with spoken Latin. But of course, that required years and years of education in order to reach that level of refinement in that language. And so the ability to speak Latin in a very proper way, of course, wasn't accessible to those of lower classes. That all changed when Christianity was adopted as the religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Why? Because Christianity affirms the equality of all people and the focus on the individual. And this lended a certain legitimacy to the kinds of slang or the kinds of language habits, if you will, spoken by the lower classes. So that sort of got rid of this emphasis on speaking perfect classical Latin, and instead the Roman Empire entered into this time where they spoke what is called vulgar Latin, which led to a lot of literacy among the population. Again, just a very important fact that you should know to combat people who smear Christianity with one broad brush. The Roman Empire collapsed in the 6th century, and this is where the Romance languages and their separation occurred. There was no longer this unity in the education system and in the government institutions. And so since there was a vast territorial separation from Spain and France and Italy, that is where dialects form. Because if you look at Spanish or Italian or French, basically all three of those languages are just dialectized Latin. So French emerged for the first time as a written language in the 9th century, and Spanish and Italian emerged for the first time as a written language in the 10th century. This synopsizes why I love studying language so much. I've heard people say, I don't know a lot about history. That's not true. All of us know a lot, actually, about history if we just look up and pay attention. History is all around us. There are all of these scattered clues. If you think that Spanish sounds a lot like Italian, which sounds a lot like French, there's a reason for that. It's probably because at one point they had a shared language. They were the same language, or they at least have a common origin. And the thing that synopsizes history the most with regard to language are names, which transitions us into this next section. Did you know that half of the U.S. states bear Indian tribe names, and the remainder of them show historical roots also? But isn't that amazing? Half of the states, 25, are named after Indian tribes. For instance, North and South Dakota. Dakota means leagued or allied, and it represents that in those territories there was a confederation of different tribes that lived there. Tennessee is also named after an Indian tribe. Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, Kentucky, Illinois, Texas, Idaho, and even Massachusetts. Even cities throughout the United States also have names that are sort of tied to or originate with the spoken Indian language of that territory. For instance, Chicago. This one is fun. Chicago comes from a certain Indian tribe's name, Chickahua, which means place of skunk smells. Manhattan, of course, in New York, means in the language of the Delaware Indians, the place where we all got drunk. Again, history is all around us. And even if you look at the other states, it shows the history or sort of our ties with European colonial powers. For instance, Virginia, Maryland, Carolina, and Georgia are all named after monarchs in England: Virginia, Mary, Charles, and Georgia, respectively. The state of Louisiana was named after King Louis of France because we bought that territory from the French. Even if you look at states like New York, New Jersey, and New Mexico, maybe I was an idiot for not realizing this, they are named after old world cities. New York is New York, because York is a city in the country of England. What do you mean? Did I say maybe? Me? Sean said, did you say maybe? Maybe you were an idiot? Hey, you know what? You didn't know what the was either, and you thought Romance languages were because they sound sexy, okay? We're all idiots here. New Mexico. I didn't know this. New Mexico was part of the territory of Mexico, and so that's why it's called New Mexico. Okay, this is why I read books, to educate myself. California actually is the hardest state to understand what its origins are, because it derives from the name Califerne, which is an imaginary land appearing in an 11th century French epic. But it sort of makes sense that California would be that one state where the historical origins are sort of unknown, but it represents this fairy tale imaginary land. But the point is, names can denote so much. If you look at Bolivia, the country in South America, it's named after Simon Bolivar, who led the struggle to liberate South America from Spanish rule. Or Colombia is named after Christopher Columbus. Even the fact that we call Native Americans Indians has historical roots. It's because when Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, he thought that he reached India. So he was calling the people on the land Indians because he thought they were Indians. Saudi Arabia, for instance, is named for the Saud family, which is the ruling family of Saudi Arabia since the 1920s. It used to be called Arabia. Now it's Saudi Arabia. Caesarea is a beautiful sort of coastal town in the state of Israel that I was lucky enough to visit. And if you look at that name, there's Caesar in it. You wonder why that is? It's because the Roman Empire at one point went all the way up and conquered what is now the land of Israel. Ecuador, as another example, reminds us that that country traverses the equator. France is named after the Franks, which were a certain tribe that conquered the country that is now France. Even if you look at names in the Soviet Union, Stalingrad, Leningrad were new cities that were named in the Soviet Union. Again, there are scattered clues all around us in history. If you took someone and brought them to Los Angeles and they knew nothing about Los Angeles, Even just by hearing the name, that person would be able to surmise that the city may have a Spanish population or a Spanish-speaking population, and that it was once ruled by a Spanish-speaking population. Another example of how history, or how there are all these scattered clues of history with regard to names, is also in family and personal names. Look at the name Walter Johnson. How do you think a name like that, or the last name Johnson, emerged? It's because this guy Walter, literally like thousands of years ago, was introduced as Walter Johnson. That's how the name emerged. Even if you look at my dear producer who recently called me an idiot, Sean McConnell, Mick in Gaelic means son of. So Sean, you have an ancestor who is named Connell. Congratulations, my friend. Or O, like O'Brien. Whoever is the last name O'Brien has a Brian in their ancestry. Or even if you look at names like John Baker or John Taylor, John Collier, the last name Baker or Taylor or Collier indicates probably the profession of an ancestor because people were referred to as John the Baker or John the Collier. I'll bring in another dear producer of mine, Rick Locke. Rick, maybe you had a locksmith in your family back in the day. Another example of last names. Oh, did you? He's about to speak to me. John Locke. John Locke? You're related to John Locke? Holy moly. Rick's family built America. John Locke is very much responsible for our understanding of our laws and Constitution. Congratulations. That's amazing. Even if you look at my last name, Hartman, maybe I'm just flattering myself by thinking this, but I probably had an ancestor who had a big heart. You would be amazed as to how many last names indicate a characteristic or a profession or an old name of someone that goes way back in your lineage. By the way, because I opened this show talking about Iceland, another cool thing about Iceland is that they have a very specific formula for naming sons. It's first name plus your father's first name, son. So Dennis Prager, his father was named Max. So in Iceland, his name would be Dennis Maxson. Dennis has a son, David. In Iceland, his son David would be named David Dennisson. Sort of efficient to have sort of a systemized way of naming. In Japan and China, family names are very, very common. For instance, if you look at Chiang Kai-shek, actually, Chiang Kai-shek's first name is Kai-shek. It's not his last name. He is named Kai-shek of the Chiang family. Again, very commonly in Japan and China, your family name is put first, and then your first name is put second. So all that I just told you about in this episode was really what I learned from Mario Pai and also from sort of outside research I did in conjunction with reading this book about language. But what I'll leave you here with finally is sort of my editorial comment, some of the things that I've observed from learning about different languages. Distinctions are such an important part of a civilization. We have to be able to distinguish between holy and profane, legal and illegal, right and wrong. As we're seeing here in the United States, we need to be able to distinguish between man and woman. And when those distinctions sort of disintegrate, that is in turn the disintegration of society. Again, as we're seeing now with this crazy sexualization of children movement where children are being taught that there's no such thing as man and woman and that they can have drag queens twerk in front of them. That is all an elimination of certain distinctions. And so the thing that I learned from reading this book is that these distinctions are mirrored in language. And if a civilization's language has a lot of distinctions, that probably means it is a more advanced civilization. For instance, if you look at early American Indian tribes, they did not distinguish between man and woman, or crucially, between man and animal in the way that they named people. A tribal leader could be called Bald Eagle or Old Bear. That indicates no difference between a man and an animal. But over time in our civilization, we came to make those distinctions. A really good counterexample to prove my point is if you look at the Soviet Union, one of the things that they tried to do was eliminate distinctions. They did not want you referring to someone as she or he. they wanted you to refer to a fellow person as comrade or citizen. In fact, they would throw you in jail if you referred to someone as she or he. So the more distinctions you have, it more or less indicates that that civilization values the individual, because the more distinctions, the more individualized that individual is. Another distinction that I think is so important and revelatory of the civilization in which the language is spoken is the way that politeness is suffused into language. Look at what we do in English. We call someone Mr. or Mrs. In Spanish, they do señor or señora. In many other languages, they have these distinctions in superiority or in age. And even if you look at a language like Spanish, and this is true in a lot of languages, but not English, they have a formal and informal you. In Spanish, it is tú versus usted. And I remember when I was in Spanish class, there were quizzes where they would ask you, what is the proper way that you would call a friend? You would say tú, versus if you had a teacher, you would refer to her as usted. It's very, very sort of segmented, and it indicates your superiority or the way that you should treat elders. And I think that's really nice, actually. We used to have that in English. Believe it or not, it used to be thou versus thee. I'm not sure which was the polite and which one was the informal, but we did have that separation. And as our society over time became more lackadaisical with regard to politeness, we eliminated those distinctions. But in a language like Spanish, you always have to keep this element of politeness in the back of your mind when you're speaking, because you have to be proper with the kind of you use. In English, it is very easy to avoid calling someone Mr. or Mrs. But in Spanish, it's much, much harder to avoid using the word you. Another example of sort of this politeness is that many languages have salutations that are sort of exchanges of goodwill, and they're actually really beautiful. For instance, if you look at Semitic languages, such as Arabic, it is common for individuals to greet each other by saying, and by the way, strangers, not even people that you would know, peace be upon you, and then the response is, and upon you be peace. That's in Arabic. In Russian, they say, be healthy, and then the person will say back, and you be healthy too. English actually used to have a counterpart. Look at the word goodbye. Goodbye was actually once God be with you, and then over time it became shortened to goodbye. Hello used to be whole or be healthy, and it was shortened to hello. And again, it's very interesting how in English we no longer sort of have these exchanges of goodwill. I guess, when you go to a grocery store and you're talking to a cashier and you say, how are you? And they say, I'm fine, how are you? That's sort of a rote exchange of this goodwill, but we've really lost those salutations. And I think it indicates something about our society that we no longer do that. Yes, Sean? Oh, well, Sean says there's an update for me on my last name, Hartman. So tell me, I have a relative. Oh, it's possible that my ancestors were hunters because hart refers to a red stag deer. Is that what you said? But you're saying, Sean was saying that, the last name Strongman maybe indicates that that person was strong. So yes, but the point is your last name, whether it's a character trait or whether it's a profession or a name, can indicate something about your ancestral heritage, which is cool. The final example I'll give on this subject of distinctions and politeness is that in 1961, the British Parliament actually published a manual of expressions which were permissible to be used by government leaders. And actually, one of the words that was barred in the Parliament was the word liar. And it wasn't that you couldn't call someone a liar, it's that you couldn't say it as overtly as calling someone a liar. And they had a list of like 120 ways that you could call someone a liar without saying the word. One example is trifler of the truth, or to use Churchill's saying, guilty of terminology inexactitude. And so actually, even though that seems a little bit, I don't know, like throwing people for a loop or sort of just stupid to not call someone what you think they are, I actually think that's really sort of indicative of a proper society. Trifler of the truth is a much more elegant and less sort of mean way to call someone a liar. And I think that indicates that no matter what you think of a person, you should always confer a certain level of respect and politeness upon them. And it just shows, again, our language, the words we use, the way that we communicate, obviously says a lot about our civilization, but it also says so much about the way that we view ourselves and if we value other people. As I told you at the beginning, I'm only halfway in this Mario Pie book, so if you'd like me to do a part 2, be sure to indicate that in the comments down below. And thanks so much. I'll see you soon.